On the evening of the 9th of April 1991, at the southeast corner of 42th Street and 3rd Avenue in Manhattan, workmen with chisels and hammers began prying stainless steel machines out of a wall inside the last Horn and Hardart automat in America. They screwed off marble-covered turn knobs. They pulled out tiny black-on-white signs: Kaiser roll with jelly, pot of baked beans, bologna sandwich. None of the customers eating dinner that night had been told. The manager locked the doors at 6 o'clock, 2 hours before closing time. He put up a small sign. It read, "Closed for alterations." The company did not want a landmark fuss. That is the end. Now the question. It is a strange one, because the food was good, the coffee was famous, and the people who ate there remembered it for the rest of their lives. Why did nobody eat at the automat anymore? The short answer runs against every instinct. The automat wasn't killed by bad food. It wasn't killed by dirty tables or rude staff or a public that lost interest. It was killed, more than anything else, by a cup of coffee. 5 cents, for 38 years, poured from a silver dolphin's head spout into a porcelain cup. 90 million of them sold a year at the peak. It was the most celebrated product the company ever made. Irving Berlin wrote a song about it. Mel Brooks wrote a song about it. And for years, at the end, according to the people who eventually ran the numbers, Horn and Hardart lost money on every single cup. That is the story this video is about. How a chain of restaurants became the beating heart of everyday eating in New York for half a century, and how the thing that made them famous slowly turned into the thing they could not survive. The story starts in Philadelphia, not New York. On the 22nd of December, 1888, Joseph Horn and Frank Hardart opened an 11 by 17-foot lunchroom at 39 South 13th Street, directly opposite Wanamaker's department store. There was no dining room, only a counter, and 15 stools. Horn was born in Philadelphia, the son of the founder of a surgical instrument company. Hardart had been born in Sondernheim, Bavaria, brought to New Orleans in 1858 as a child, and put to work at a lunch counter at the age of 13. There he learned to brew coffee the New Orleans way, the French drip method, a slow, cold extraction process that produced a concentrate richer and less bitter than anything brewed by speed. The two men had met when Hardart answered an advertisement Horn had placed in the paper for a partner. They had a simple idea: serve good food, cheaply. Horn's line, quoted for decades afterward, was, "There is no trick to selling a poor item cheaply. The real trick is to sell a good item cheaply." For 14 years, that was the entire business. Then, in 1900, Frank Hardart went to Berlin. What he saw there was a restaurant called the Quisisana, a restaurant with no waiters. Customers dropped a coin into a slot, opened a small glass door, and pulled out a plate of food. The machinery had been designed by a German engineer named Max Seelaf. Hardart paid $30,000, a fortune at the time, and ordered a set for Philadelphia. The ship carrying that machinery collided with another vessel in dense fog off the English coast and sank. The insurance paid. Hardart ordered a replacement. It took another 2 years, and so, on the 9th of June, 1902, Horn and Hardart opened the first American automat at 818 Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. The word automat itself comes from the Greek automatos, meaning self-acting. It was a strange word for a restaurant that would spend the next 89 years quietly staffed by hundreds of invisible people. 10 years later, the New York flagship. Tuesday, the 2nd of July, 1912, 1 in the afternoon. The address was 1557 Broadway in Times Square, adjoining the Globe Theater. 3 stories, designed by the Philadelphia firm of Stuckert and Sloan, with terracotta ornamentation and arched entrances. The facade was stained glass by an artist named Nicola Desenzo, with the word automat running across it in Art Nouveau letters. It cost $80,000 to build. A senior executive named Robert Burns described the place decades later this way: "A classy place, all that Carrara marble and miles of patterned white tile and the shiny chrome and the spotless plate glass automat machine windows, pillars, elegant lamps on the ceiling. You'd have to look hard to find a scrap of paper on the floor. The machinery inside was American-made, patented. Not German this time. This was the first automat anywhere in the world to run on that. The Times Square subway disgorged 200,000 people a day onto the streets of the Great White Way. The boarding houses and cheap hotels around the theaters supplied a 3-meal-a-day clientele of theater hands, clerks, and blue-collar workers. Immigration in the previous decade had brought nearly 1 million newcomers to the city. They stayed up late, they moved fast, and they positively enjoyed buying things from machines. The automat was open. Here is how it worked. You walked in the middle of the room, inside a glass booth, sat a woman. She was called a nickel thrower. You gave her $1. Without counting, she pushed 20 nickels across a marble counter with the tips of her fingers, which were covered in rubber tips because the coins tarnished her hands. The tarnishing was so bad she was required to wear a black uniform. If a customer wanted to know how good she was at her job, they could watch. Mostly they didn't. They took their nickels and walked to the wall. The wall was hundreds of small windows. Each window was a compartment behind a piece of glass. Each compartment had a slot, a chrome knob with a porcelain center, and a label: chicken pot pie, baked beans, macaroni and cheese, Salisbury steak, coconut cream pie, lemon meringue pie, egg salad sandwich, 3 nickels, ham and egg sandwich, 10 cents. Coffee, 5 cents, from a silver spout shaped like a dolphin's head, modeled on the fountains of Florence, which Joseph Horn had seen on a trip to Europe years before. You dropped your nickels, you turned the knob, you lifted the door, you took your plate to a marble table, and sat wherever you wanted. You did not need to speak English. You did not need to tip. You did not need to know the manners of a formal restaurant. You could sit for an hour. You could sit for 3. Nobody would hustle you out. Behind the wall, the illusion required a small army. The word automat meant self-acting. The reality was that the second a customer removed a sandwich from a compartment, a worker on the other side of the glass slipped a fresh one into the empty slot. The food itself was cooked at a single commissary. For the New York chain, a bakery building at 600 West 50th Street that eventually expanded to fill an entire city block. Trucks fanned out from there several times a day. Every dish arrived from one kitchen. Every recipe was standardized in a leather-bound manager's manual that covered nearly 400 menu items and specified how many times per day the tabletops were to be wiped. It was, in practical terms, Frederick Winslow Taylor's scientific management applied to a dining room, every motion timed, every portion measured, every variable controlled from a single center. The coffee was the point of pride. Every 20 minutes, an employee filled out a time card, discarded whatever remained in the pot, and brewed a fresh one. Every day at 12:30, Joseph Horn and the top executives gathered around a long wooden table in the commissary called the sample table. The workers called it the ulcer table. They ate the day's food. They tasted a cup of coffee sent up from a different automat each day, and if it was even slightly off, an entire batch could be thrown out. There were also, quietly, the day-old shops, 3 of them in New York. When an automat closed for the night, the surplus was carted to a shop in a low-income neighborhood and sold at a discount. Nothing was left overnight. Nothing was reheated the next day. That was the model: standardized, centralized, waiterless, and tipless. And, most of the time, cheap. For 50 cents a diner could eat 3 meals a day. One more part of the business is worth naming here, before we move on. Many of the people behind the wall who cooked the food were black. The automat has been remembered for decades as the great equalizer of American public dining. Every color, every class, every religion sitting at the same marble tables. That is true of the front of the house. According to the family history written by Frank Hardart's great-granddaughter, though, African American employees worked mostly as chefs and were not allowed to be seen serving food or placing it into the automat machines. The black workforce that helped feed hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers a day stayed behind the glass, where nobody in the dining room could see them. Keep the wall in mind. Its part in this story is not finished. By the early 1930s, New York had 43 Horn and Hardart automats in Manhattan and 27 retail shops selling the same food packaged for the walk home, spread across Manhattan, the Bronx, and Long Island. The retail shops carried a slogan on every wrapper. It read, "Less work for mother." By the middle of the decade, the automat had entered the parts of American life that ordinary places rarely reach. In 1927, on Valentine's Day, a painter named Edward Hopper exhibited a new oil at the Wren Galleries in New York. The painting depicts a woman alone at a marble table at night, staring into a coffee cup. In the black window behind her, rows of ceiling lights run away into the distance. The picture is called Automat. It sold within 2 months for $1,200. It has become, in the decades since, one of the definitive American paintings of loneliness in a modern city. It now hangs at the Des Moines Art Center in Iowa. The model for the painting was Hopper's wife, Josephine Nivison Hopper. In the picture, Hopper made her younger than she was. She was 44, and he made her thinner than she was. Jo Hopper was a full-figured woman. The woman in the painting is not. The most famous painting of the automat is a portrait of the artist's wife, with the wife quietly edited out. In 1932, Irving Berlin wrote, "Let's have another cup of coffee" for a Broadway musical called Face the Music. It became the automat's unofficial theme song. Every Depression optimism song afterward eventually had to answer to it. The automat entered the movies. In 1934, Joan Crawford, playing a woman down on her luck in Sadie McKee, sat in an automat and quietly watched another patron's meal. In 1937, Preston Sturges wrote a screwball comedy called Easy Living, in which a malfunctioning automat flipped all its little doors open at once and set off a riot of free food. In 1962, Cary Grant and Doris Day filmed extended scenes in a New York automat for a picture called That Touch of Mink, which opened to record-breaking receipts at Radio City Music Hall. In 1933, the New York Sun printed a rhyme about the crowd at the automat. It went like this: said the technocrat, to the plutocrat, to the autocrat, and the Democrat, let's all go eat at the automat. There was some truth to it. A Wall Street banker, and an out-of-work stagehand, and a night shift printer, and a woman on her lunch break from a stenographer's job could sit at the same round table, and none of them would be treated as if they belonged less than the others. This was rare in the New York of the 1930s, where competing chains like Schrafft's catered explicitly to a white-collar female clientele, and Child's restaurants, though cheap, carried their own social hierarchies. The automat had none of that. It was rare enough that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, half a century later, would say the automat showcased the great USA with people of all different colors and religions and manner of dress. It was rare enough that Neil Simon, in 1987, called it the Maxims of the disenfranchised. It was also, quietly, something else. According to the historian George Chauncey, in his book on gay life in New York before 1940, automats were among the safest refuges available to poorer gay men. They became even more secure during the Depression, when their rock-bottom prices and lack of supervision gave them a reputation as a sanctuary for social outcasts and the unemployed. The automat sold nobody out. It also, on principle, asked nobody who they were. Not everybody approved. In 1914, a critic named James Huneker wrote in the New York Times that the number of cheap quick-fire food hells is appalling, and that eating and drinking are rapidly entering the category of the lost fine arts. He was arguing against exactly the thing the automat did best. Nobody was listening. Growing up in Brooklyn, Mel Brooks used to take the subway with his brothers all the way to the Times Square automat. 60 years later, he still remembered why. That was the great thing about the automat, he said. You needed a lot of nickels. You didn't need a lot of money. The middle of the 1950s. A lunchtime crowd in Manhattan. You are in the Times Square flagship at 1557 Broadway, or in the Art Deco place at 2710 Broadway at 104th Street, or in any of the 40-odd other automats scattered through the city. The room is warm from the steam tables at the back. The floor is patterned white tile. The ceiling is high. The dolphin spouts release a precisely measured stream of coffee at an exactly calibrated temperature. The nickel thrower is pushing coins across her counter without counting them. The wall is a grid of little glass windows, filling and emptying, and filling and emptying again, as the invisible workers behind them keep pace with the crowd. Somebody sits down beside you. You have never seen them before. You will never see them again. Neither of you says anything. Both of you are drinking coffee that costs a nickel. This is the peak. In 1950, the New York company alone was pouring 500,000 cups of coffee a day. At the mid-decade high, the chain was serving 800,000 people a day across New York and Philadelphia, 90 million cups of coffee a year. In 1953, the New York business grossed $41.8 million in revenue. Philadelphia grossed nearly $30 million. In 1954, New York had 45 automat cafeterias, 44 retail shops, and 3-day-old shops all open at the same time. In 1958, corporate earnings hit their all-time high. Kent Barwick, the man who ran the Municipal Art Society, said years later that the automats were right up there with the Statue of Liberty and Madison Square Garden. He was talking about a chain of self-service restaurants that had convinced a city they belonged in the same sentence as its two most famous monuments. Everything about the operation was working. 500,000 cups a day of coffee, at 5 cents each, which is exactly where the trouble came from. On the 29th of November 1950, Horn and Hardart raised the price of a cup of coffee from 5 cents to 10 cents. The New York Times reported it the next day. It was the first time the price had changed since the 2nd of July 1912. 38 years of nickel coffee ended in a single memo. Inside the company, this was already known to have come too late. The machines built at the beginning had been designed to accept nickels only. That was a decision made in Berlin before Frank Hardart had ever ordered the equipment. One denomination, one slot per compartment. As inflation ate at the American economy through the 1940s, Horn and Hardart could not raise prices gradually. Every increase had to move in 5-cent jumps. According to the automat historian Alex Schuldiner, whose doctoral thesis was about this exact problem, the company was structurally locked into pricing built around the coin. It had built the machines had built the price, and the price could not now be changed by a single cent. For years before that November memo, the company had been losing money on every cup of coffee it sold. Its most famous product, the thing every customer went in to buy, had turned into a subsidy. A 5-cent product in a 10-cent economy. The moment they raised it to a dime, they lost the story. Automat coffee had been a nickel for 38 years. It stopped being a nickel, and the thing it had meant stopped meaning that too. At almost the same moment, a competitor named William Black, who ran a growing chain of coffee shops in New York called Chock Full o' Nuts, held onto his own 5-cent cup by watering the coffee down. He held for as long as he could. Then he broke ranks, raised his price cleanly, and announced to the public that he refused to serve worse coffee. Chock Full o' Nuts took a piece of the market and did not give it back. The coffee was one force. It was not the only one. The second force was the country moving. In the years after the Second World War, the middle-class New York customer, who had been coming in for a full lunch and a proper dinner, began, in enormous numbers, to leave the city for the suburbs. The commissary in a single building at 600 West 50th Street had been an economic miracle when the customer lived a subway ride away. It became a fixed cost when the customer lived an hour by car. The third force was the food itself. In 1954, Ray Kroc joined the McDonald brothers, and in the years that followed, McDonald's and Burger King and White Castle and a handful of others adopted much of what Horn and Hardart had invented. The cheap prices, and the standardized recipes, and the minimal service, and stripped away what they had not. No marble, no dolphin spouts, no sitting for hours, no dining room to keep clean, and, Crucially, drive-thrus. A drive-thru does not need 43 Manhattan storefronts full of tables and chairs. A drive-thru does not care where the middle class has moved to. It follows them. Horn and Hardart could not follow them. The automat, by design, required a customer who was willing to sit down and stay a while. That customer had moved. The fourth force was slow and the most painful. By the middle of the 60s, the automats that had been famous for never asking who anybody was began to fill with people who had nowhere else to go. Homeless New Yorkers came in with a coffee cup and used the condiment bar to make a soup out of ketchup and mustard. Elderly customers on a fixed check bought a coffee and sat for 4 hours. The automat's oldest principle, that anyone could sit as long as they liked, had not changed. What had changed was the middle-class family, with 2 other places to eat that afternoon. They stopped coming. The dining room emptied out. The machines still worked. When a business built on 800,000 paying customers a day drops to a fraction of that, and when the missing customers are the ones who used to buy a meal instead of a nickel coffee, the model breaks. By the late 1960s, the company was looking for a way out. In 1965, the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority forced Horn and Hardart to close their Philadelphia commissary to make way for a Thomas Jefferson University dormitory. In May of 1969, the original 818 Chestnut Street automat went to auction. The first one, the one Frank Hardart had waited 2 years for after his machinery sank in fog. Its interior was donated to the Smithsonian. In 1972, the company filed for bankruptcy. It was bought by a mail-order catalog company called Hanover House Industries. Its most valuable remaining asset was no longer its restaurants. It was the real estate the restaurants sat on. Around the country, but especially in Manhattan, Horn and Hardart began closing its own automats and opening Burger King franchises in the same buildings, operated by the same company. The Times Square flagship, 1557 Broadway, the one that had opened in 1912 with American-made patented machinery, was converted to a Horn and Hardart-owned Burger King. On the 20th of March 1978, the New York Times ran an article that included this line: Whopper hamburgers have replaced such Horn and Hardart staples as baked beans. Buildings that had been landmarks in their own neighborhoods came apart in specific sequence. The 975 8th Avenue Automat was demolished. The 122 Pearl Street Automat was demolished. The 1165 6th Avenue Automat, with its Art Deco terracotta panels, was demolished. The 202 West 23th Street Automat was demolished. The 104 West 57th Street Automat was demolished. Down came the commissary at 600 West 50th Street, the building that had once fed the whole city. Even after the corporate parent had lost interest in restaurants, the underlying real estate kept its value. That was the point. In 1979, the company bought a hotel in Las Vegas called the Royal Inn for $7.4 million, renamed it the Royal Americana with a New York theme, poured $3.5 million into renovations, ran up substantial losses, and sold the property in December of 1982 for $15.4 million. In 1981, it bought Bojangles' famous chicken and biscuits. In 1990, it sold Bojangles for $20 million. In 1987, it opened 2 1950s-themed restaurants in New York called Dinomat. They closed within 2 years. None of this was an automat. By May of 1990, the last automat in the Philadelphia area, in a place called Bala Sinwid, was closed. The last one still standing anywhere in the country was in a modest ground-floor space at the base of a 1958 office tower called the Lorillard Building at 200 East 42th Street on the southeast corner of 3rd Avenue. It had opened on the 12th of August, 1958, 3 years after the peak year for corporate earnings. It had been for sale for a year. Nobody was buying. The reporter David Isay got the call at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 9th of April, 1991. Somebody in the industry told him, "They're closing down the Horn and Hardart tonight, on the sly. They don't want any kind of landmark fuss. Don't tell anyone I told you." He arrived at 200 East 42th Street about a half hour later. At first, everything looked normal. The tables were crowded with older men and women drinking coffee, reading the paper, talking. Then he heard the drilling. In the back, workmen had already begun to dismantle the machines that had defined the enterprise for 89 years. They were, in Issei's words, cracking them apart from the wall with chisels and hammers, screwing off the marble-covered turn knobs, pulling out the tiny black-on-white signs beside each compartment. Kaiser roll with jelly, pot of baked beans, bologna sandwich. None of the customers had been told. Issei walked through the dining room and asked them, one at a time, what they thought about the news he was about to give them. One said the place had been there for over 50 years, and they couldn't be closing it. Not tonight, not on the sly. Another said he had come there for the first time 75 years ago. A woman said, I was brought up in the Automat. My mother brought me here. I was a hard kid to feed at home. I liked to go out to eat. No matter how good she was a cook, I liked coming to the Automat. An elderly man said, this was years ago, a poor man's paradise. People didn't have too much money years ago. People could come in here and ate like a rich person. They could eat, relax, enjoy, meet their people. It was nice. A 97-year-old woman looked up at Issei and said, oh, am I happy I was here to have a cup of coffee? I'll miss it so much. I'm 97 years old. I never miss to come here. It hurts. What happened? Tell me. At 6 o'clock, the manager locked the two large revolving doors at the front of the Automat, 2 hours before the usual closing time. Customers arriving for dinner pushed the doors, which budged a little and would not turn. They shrugged and walked away. The manager put up his small sign. It read, closed for alterations. Inside, a few customers were still at their tables. Issei stayed and watched them. He wrote down what he saw. They read. They chatted. They lingered over a last coffee. When a little of it spilled onto their trays, they poured it back into their cups to make it last just a little longer. The next day, Kent Barwick told the New York Times that automats had been right up there with the Statue of Liberty and Madison Square Garden. That was all. The building at 1557 Broadway is still there. It was designed in 1911 for a cost of $80,000, opened in July of 1912 with the first American-made automat machinery ever installed, converted to a Burger King in the late 70s, and is currently covered in billboards. In the winter of 2024, construction crews took the billboards down for maintenance, and the original terracotta facade came briefly back into view. Inside the ground floor, which is now a souvenir shop called Grand Slam New York, the original brass staircase and a plaster ram's head from the 1912 detailing are still there if you know where to look. The tax assessor market value of that building today is $18 million. It cost $80,000 to build in 1911. That is the number, more than any other, that tells you what happened. A place worth 225 times what it took to build is no longer a restaurant. It is a piece of real estate that once had a restaurant in it. The building at 2710 Broadway at 104th Street is a New York City landmark, designated in 2007. The Art Deco terracotta panels on its upper floors are the ones that were painted green and blue and tan and gold luster by the Atlantic Terracotta Company in 1930. Horn and Hardart moved out in 1953. The ground floor today is a Rite Aid. The commissary at 600 West 50th Street is gone. The Philadelphia flagship at 818 Chestnut Street was auctioned in 1969, and its interior, 35 feet of mirrors and marble and marquetry, was donated to the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. It sat in the museum cafe for years. It has since been removed from display. The space where the last automat stood, at 42th Street and 3rd Avenue, is now, according to a report from 2025, a gap. On a wall on West 48th Street, in fading paint, a ghost sign advertises a Horn Hardart automat that has not been in that building for more than half a century. The Horn Hardart brand itself is being revived. A new company has taken it over, has recreated the original East Coast City Roast coffee, and sells it online. Its chief executive has said publicly that he intends, one day, to reopen an automat. There have been other attempts to revive the form. Modern self-service concepts like Itza, which briefly operated in several American cities in the 2010s, tried to update the automat idea with touchscreens and grain bowls. None of them lasted. The original was 89 years old when they shut it down. Every so often, in an antique warehouse in Hudson, New York, an original Horn Hardart food dispenser unit, restored, comes up for sale. The listing price is $10,000. The silver dolphin spouts, modeled on the fountains of Florence, were mostly dismantled in the early 1990s. Only a handful survive. They are in private collections. They rarely come up for sale. The machinery began off the coast of England in the year 1900 on a ship that sank in fog. It ended on the 9th of April 1991 on East 42th Street, prized apart from a wall with chisels and hammers, while the customers who had come in for dinner poured the last of their coffee back into their cups.